Avraham, Father of mercies, we worship you, Lord. We thank you for this time together. We thank you for the move and presence of your Ruach HaKodesh, your Holy Spirit in our midst today. Lord, I pray that you will continue to breathe into our hearts and our lives as we open up your word, that you will speak boldly into our hearts and our lives, that it be your voice heard, your word received, that nothing of me will be involved except that which you have ordained specifically for this purpose. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu. In the name of Yeshua our Messiah we pray, and everyone says, Amen. So as we said earlier this week, we read Parasha Sh'lach L'cha, which is Numbers 13:1 through 15:41. And Parasha Sh'lach covers a lot of ground as we look through it. And just as a quick reminder as we begin to dig into the text today, the book of Numbers itself takes up roughly 38 years of Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. All right, I don't know if you've sat down and thought that through or not. I just like to put some context in there for you. The book of Numbers absorbs approximately 38 years, maybe just a touch short, but approximately 38 years of Israel's journey in the wilderness. The book of Deuteronomy, which you'll hear me call this again as we get into it in a few weeks, but the book of Deuteronomy I often call the book that should have never been, because had it not been for this week's Parsha, then the book of Deuteronomy would not exist, because we would have already been in the Promised Land. But the book of Deuteronomy is roughly the last month or so, month and a half of Israel's journey before crossing into the Promised Land. And at that point, the entirety of the first generation of Israel had died off, and the second generation was biting at the bit to get into the Promised Land. So this week's Parasha Sh'lach L'cha, as I said, covers a lot of ground, most of which we are not going to be able to cover completely and adequately today. But as a brief synopsis, as we like to do each week, beginning with chapter 13 and the 12 spies of Israel, which was one from each of the tribes being sent out across the Jordan to reconnoiter the Promised Land. And then out of those 12, 10 come back with an evil report of the Promised Land, and the nation of Israel as a whole rejects the land because of it. In chapter 14, we see Israel grumbling and complaining about the bad report that they've now heard from the 10 spies. They try to mutiny against Moses and Aaron. I know, shocker, happens quite a few times, but they try to mutiny against Moses and Aaron. Joshua and Caleb, who were the only two spies to bring back a good report, try to calm the crowd and encourage them to push forward into the Promised Land anyways. And Moses intercedes for the nation and reminds Hashem of the 13 attributes that we find in Exodus 34:6-7. And then the Lord condemns Israel to 40 years in the wilderness until the first generation dies out. And Israel suddenly gets indignant, and they try to take the land anyways, which then becomes a really horrible fail. In chapter 15, the Lord describes how offerings by fire should be presented as a fragrant aroma before him once Israel enters the Promised Land. He delineates between unintentional and intentional sins. And then lastly, our Parsha for this week, it concludes with the command to wear tzitziot, or the fringes, the tassels that we wear on the four-cornered garment on the talit katan, which means small talit, that we wear on a regular basis. And so you have the command for the tzitziot, whether it's on the talit katan, which is the more rough, more accurate way of living it out, or the more traditional way, which is with the talit gadol, the large talits that we wear in ceremony and services and prayers, which is a way of interacting with that command, even though a four-corner garment is no longer kind of a normal thing that is worn by most people. So as we dive into the text, I just want to share a little bit as kind of a setup from my own life and my own experience. And I warned Danielle in advance, because there have been quite a few times that I'll share something in a message, and I'll get home and she goes, "Why didn't you warn me I was going to cry when you talked?" So I sent her a text, said, "You're probably going to cry today, just a heads up." But the truth is, I might too, who knows. But so some of you know our story. Some of you have heard us talk about it before, and so on. But we tried for a long time to have kids. And as far as the medical community told us, it was never going to happen. The doctors told us we were never going to have kids. In fact, our children, we had decided early in our marriage that we wanted to give our kids names that were in Hebrew, rather than the kind of American Jewish way of here's your English name and here's your Hebrew name that you'll use at your bar bat mitzvah and probably forget at some point later on. We wanted our kids to have Hebrew names because Hebrew, every word has a very distinct and intentional meaning. And if we look through Scripture, all of the names of everyone we find in Scripture, their names spoke directly to who God created them to be and what their purpose in life was. And so for us, it was really important for us to give our kids Hebrew names. And we had been married for about 8 years before Eliana came along, but we had tried for years before that not before getting married. I heard how that might sound, and I didn't want to freak anybody out, but we had tried for years before Eliana was born to have children, and it just wasn't panning out. We felt like we knew without a doubt that this was a promise that God gave us, that we were going to have children, and so we had a passion and a desire to see that promise come about, and we had tried for 4 or 5 years before we had Eliana, but as I said, the doctors told us, and Danielle went to one of the foremost doctors in the world to deal with a specific issue, who happened to also be Israeli, and the father of a movie star that we are well acquainted with, not personally, but from the movies. And it was funny because the person that recommended we go to him was like, look, he's so-and-so's father, but he doesn't like when people bring it up, so don't bring it up. He wants you to come because of his practice, because of what he does in that field, but he doesn't want his daughter brought up. And so we're sitting in his office, and behind his desk is this credenza with bookcases and all, and it's just plastered with pictures of him and his daughter at like award shows and all. I'm like, how do you not talk about it? It's right there. Like, what do you mean don't talk to him about it? But nonetheless, I get back on track again. Nonetheless, we go to the doctor, and he says, look, the reality is medically speaking, you'll likely never get pregnant. And he said, even with help, with like in vitro and so on, even with help, you'll likely never get pregnant. And we went, you got to be kidding me here. Like this was, and we started going to that doctor originally because our insurance said, okay, yeah, we'll pay for it. It's all good. I was working for a company in New York that was based out of California, and their insurance was technically based out of California. And so they said, yeah, we'll cover it. That's part of what the insurance covers. It's all good. So we're going here, and we start treatment. So like, if you're willing to try, we'll try, and I'll do what I can. We'll see what we can do. And so we start going through treatments, and then about, I guess, 2 months in, after they had already tried in vitro once, about 2 months into going to the doctor, our insurance, we get called, we go for our appointment, and we get called into the finance office to go, hey, you owe us $37,000 or something like that. I mean, it was some obscene amount of money. I forget exactly how much. It was some obscene amount of money. I was like, no, we don't. We have insurance. Our insurance said they were covering it all except for, the deductible each office visit or whatever it was, but they're supposed to cover it. She goes, oh, yeah, you probably want to call your insurance company because they're saying they're not going to cover it. So I call the insurance company. They're like, yeah, I know we told you we would, but we kind of messed up. In California, it's legally obligated. If the insurance policy originates out of California, it's legally obligated by the state of California to cover fertility treatments. But your policy is for, it originated as a New York policy, and that's not necessary. It's not required in New York, so we're not going to pay it. And so here we are with, literally tens of thousands of dollars that we now owe this medical office for treatments that had not been successful, and that at the point we looked at as this was our last hope, right? The doctor just told us, you're never going to get pregnant on your own. You'll likely never get pregnant with medical help. This was our last hope. And I remember driving to synagogue. At that point, we were living in New York, and I was the rabbinic intern at the synagogue that we were a part of in Long Island, and we would drive, actually at that point we had our main synagogue in Long Island, but I had helped start a congregation on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And so on Friday nights we would drive from our house, our apartment down into Manhattan on the Upper East Side, and we'd do Erev Shabbat services at the Manhattan congregation, and then we'd go home. And then Saturday morning, we'd wake up and we'd drive 45 minutes around the other way into Long Island to go to services in Long Island. And then we'd go home, and that drive home was like 3.5 hours instead of 45 minutes because of traffic, but nonetheless. So I remember on a Friday night, we're driving to service. This is right after we had to cut ties with the medical office. We told them, look, we can't afford it. There's no feasible way we can remotely do this. It's not possible. And so we told them we weren't going to be coming back. We'd figure out how to settle up the bill or whatever. And so I remember driving to synagogue that Friday night, and I'm on the phone. Danielle's in the passenger seat, and we've got a couple of friends of ours from our school, the college we were going to, that were riding with us, that were going to service with us that night. And I remember being on the phone with a friend of mine who at that point was living in Pensacola. But I remember being on the phone with a friend of mine and was just Like, you ever hit kind of mentally where you just can't take anything else? And I was sitting there talking with him on the phone. I was like, dude, like, we feel like God made this promise to us. We feel like God told us we were going to be parents, and now it's literally the rug's been ripped out from under us. I feel like Charlie Brown trying to kick the football, and God's the one yanking it away. And I said, I just don't know that I don't know that I want to continue serving a God that's going to do that, that's going to tell us this, and then the next thing I know, he's ripping it out from. I don't know that I want to do this anymore. I don't think I have any desire to have anything. Now, I'm on my way to synagogue to go be a part of the ministry team in this synagogue that we're helping run, and I'm like, I don't think I have it anymore. It was a bad week. We were processing things, and I think God has room that he allows for us to say stupid stuff, and then he goes, okay, now we both know that was stupid. Now let's move on. It's okay. I no hard feelings. I don't hold it against you. But it was very literal. It was one of those moments where I just said, you know what? Screw it. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. I don't care about this walk with the Lord. If this is how it's going to feel, if this is what it's going to be like, I don't need that. Like, I got enough disappointments in life. I don't need that too, right? But obviously we kept on, and we went through deliverance, and our rabbi said, hey, have you guys ever thought about going through deliverance? We've had experience where people had struggles getting pregnant and went through deliverance, and there was this kind of oppression, that kind of oppression that was a problem and hindering and whatever. You ever thought about going to depression? And Danielle goes, yeah, you've talked to us for like 3 years about it, and every time you bring it up, we say, okay, can we schedule something? He said, we'll get back to you. We're a little busy. Let's see and so finally he was like, all right, you know what? Forget it. Tuesday. You're coming in Tuesday. We're just going to. So we went through deliverance, and I kid you not, within about 2 months of going through deliverance, she got pregnant. Completely naturally, completely on her own. No doctors involved. Literally, as a matter of fact, when Eliana was born, we took a picture, we made a postcard, we sent it to the doctor and said, hey, thanks for nothing. But and I say thanks for nothing. The reality is we wouldn't have been in the situation where we were willing to go through deliverance and everything going on had we not gone to him and had everything else yanked out from under us and what have you. But so then Eliana's born, and Eliana's name in Hebrew very literally means, her first name and middle name are in Hebrew, and her name in Hebrew very literally means, God has answered me, I have joy. Now here's the thing that's really intriguing about that. We didn't have that name during the pregnancy. Like, we didn't come up with it while Danielle was pregnant. We didn't come up with it a few weeks before she was born. We didn't come up with it the day that we had to throw a name down on the paper in the hospital. Danielle had a journal, and she still has it somewhere packed away. We have no clue where anything is at the moment because we're in this really weird phase trying to rebuild a house. But nonetheless, it's somewhere in our stuff. She has this journal from when we first got married. We were maybe 3-4 months married, that we were talking about the future. And we had decided we wanted to give our kids Hebrew names. We didn't know how many kids we were going to have. We didn't know how many we wanted to have. But we had 4 female names and 4 male names picked out. First and middle name for each one. And the meanings written out for each one of them. And we had these names picked out. As a matter of fact, the first name, we had them in priority of what we wanted. The first name, this was the first one. This was the second one. And Eliana was born, and after everything that we had went through for 4.5, 5 years, after everything that we had went through trying to have kids, when Eliana was born, we looked at that list, and we went, forget the first one. The second one is the name for her. God has answered me. I have joy. And it was very literally this awakening moment. And I don't know, maybe some of you have been through similar circumstances. Maybe some of you are walking through some of things like this now, where you're waiting on a promise to be fulfilled, something that you knew God put on your heart, something that you've longed for, that you've been waiting for, and it feels like you're in this holding pattern that is never going to end. And odds are we all, in one way or another, have a pretty good idea of kind of what that feels like. As we're waiting for God's plans to be fulfilled in our lives, whether we're waiting for that home that we've been longing for, a bigger home or a different home or a new location, or we're waiting for a new job or some sort of financial blessing, or we're waiting for family to come to faith. How many are waiting for family to come to faith? We're waiting for our family to come to faith, or we're waiting for a health miracle in our own lives or that of our friends or family. And we all know what it feels like to be just sitting there waiting and yearning and hoping for the thing that we know God told us was going to come about, but for whatever reason has been lingering. How many are believers in Messiah that are waiting for him to come back? For 2,000 years, the body of Messiah has been in that exact same holding pattern. Look, he said he was coming back. We believe he's coming back. Every generation since John was on Patmos, every generation that has read the Revelation has read it and gone, today's our day. Look at this is happening and this is happening. And I look at Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and I go, this is when it's going down. Like I'm watching these things happen. And then I got to remind myself, but every generation since these words were written have looked at it and said, this was it. And we've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And I wonder if Peter and John had realized that it was going to be 2,000 years before Messiah comes back, what their heart would have been like in that situation. Because I struggled after 4 or 5 years. How much more what they went through? I mean, they literally gave their lives for the message of Messiah. And here we are 2,000 years later still waiting for the very same thing that they were waiting for. And so as we look at the Parsha today, I want you to kind of keep that rolling around in the back of the brain for a little while, because I feel like it's that yearning for that pattern of holding and waiting for God to do something that we know definitively is supposed to be happening, or we know definitively His promise is going to happen, but it just always feels like it's like just past our reach and we can't quite get there. I feel like that's at the heart of what we see in this week's Parsha. Right? So let's, if you have your scriptures, go ahead and open up to Exodus 13, beginning with verse 1. But before we dive into the text, I want us to keep this principle in mind as we work our way through the Parsha today, as we work our way through the message. And the principle is this: God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. So our faith must not waver when we face challenges. One more time. God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. How many have been longing for that easy life as a walk with the Lord? How many realize that Yeshua said it ain't going to happen? Yeshua told us the world was going to hate us, and they were going to, my paraphrase, they're going to crap all over us because of our faith in Yeshua. Right? He didn't actually say it that way. That's my paraphrase. But everything's going to go horrible for us sometimes because of our faith in Yeshua. But it's not us that they hate. It's Him. Right? It's Him in us. So he says, God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. So our faith must never waver when we face challenges. I can tell you, and as a matter of fact, I did tell you, my faith was wavering in a very big way when that rug got ripped out from under us by our fertility doctor in New York. When he says, look, your insurance isn't going to pay unless you're paying out of pocket. There's nothing else we could do. I already told you have no hope. But I don't know what to tell you. And here I am walking out of this office. Now, I left out the fact that the doctor is, I said he was Israeli, but the doctor is the foremost doctor in the world for dealing with this specific issue, this specific fertility issue. He's Israeli, which, if you do the math, means he's Jewish, right? And here we are as Messianic Jews walking into his office. And talking with him and praying for what God was going to do and explaining to him what we felt like was supposed to be happening and just laying it all out there. And here I am as a Messianic Jewish believer walking out of his office. Instead of him having found hope, me walking out having felt like I lost hope. Right? And so I just want you to hold on to that for a little bit as we look at our Parsha today, because this is, I feel like, at the crux and the core of what Israel is experiencing at this point in time in Numbers chapter 13. So if you have your text, go ahead and open up to Numbers 13, verse 1. If you don't, we'll have them up on the slides for you as well. Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. It says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, send some men on your behalf to investigate the land of Canaan, which I am giving to Bnei Israel. Each man you are to send will be a prince of the tribe of his fathers, a man from each tribe. So according to the word of Adonai, Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All the men were princes of Bnei Israel. Now it's interesting that here in Numbers, it says God told Moses to send the spies. When Moses is recounting this in Deuteronomy to the second generation, Moses says, you guys begged for this and God said it was okay. Right? Now, I think to some degree in Deuteronomy, he's kind of relaying to them maybe his version of the story to keep them from losing hope again and falling prey to what their forefathers went through. But nonetheless, God tells them, hey, send spies into the land. And I think most of us looking back at it, looking with the lens of what we know has happened since God said send spies, and are looking back at, God, did you not know this was going to go this way? Like, did you really not know that this was how this is going to play out? Now, I truly believe that God did, in fact, know that this was exactly how it was going to play out, because God knows all. right? He's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. He knows all. He is everywhere. He is outside of time. He's eternal. He knew good and well that the 10 spies were going to bring an evil report back. And I bring our minds and our hearts back to what I've talked about countless times before, and that is that at this point in time, we're dealing with the first generation out of Egypt. The first generation of Israel out of Egypt only ever knew the provision of the hand of Egypt as slaves. As long as they did what they were told, they didn't get beat, and they had some variance of food in front of them and a place to sleep. All they knew was Egypt's provision for their needs. Now, it was a bastardized form of provision, but they knew Egypt's provision. In fact, every time they complained against God in the wilderness, what do they say? We had food back in Egypt. We had graves back in Egypt. We had this back in Egypt. We had that back in Egypt. Why did you bring us out here to die? And God says, nope. Look, you got food at your front door every morning that I miraculously provide for you. You don't even have to do anything. You just walk out, scoop it up, and go make food. It's not that difficult for you, right? But that first generation only ever knew the provision of the hand of Egypt. The second generation that were going to ultimately take the promised land, and I believe God knew that this was going to be the case, that second generation for 40 years, as they grew up and developed into the people of God, all they knew was the miraculous hand of God providing for their every need. So when they were walking into the promised land where everything was going to be difficult, they were going to have to fight for everything, it would be easy for them to go, hey, God provided that weird stuff that we called, what's this, right? Manhu, manna in English, it's manhu in Hebrew. What is this? Like they walked out the door that first day, was like, what is this? What is it? Mahu, what is this? And, but I think God knew good and well that second generation, all they knew was God's provision, whether it was clothes that didn't wear out, shoes that didn't wear out, food that was miraculously there in front of them, water that was miraculously there, tents that didn't wear out. All they knew is God had them, and it was all okay. The first generation, all they knew was Egypt had them, and it could be okay if they went back. But this faith thing, having a walk in faith of the Lord, this just doesn't feel right. I'm not okay with this. I want to run back. How many feel like that sometimes? This faith thing, man, this is hard. Walking with faith in the Lord, this is difficult. Like I look at some of the people around me in the world around us that from our perspective looking out, looks like they got everything together, but you know without a doubt they're not walking with the Lord, right? But they got all the money, they got great houses, they got fun cars, they got everything they could ever imagine, but they traded what the Lord had for them for what the world has for them. Whereas we traded what the world has for us, we traded ourselves, what we thought we want, for what God wants, right? And sometimes we look out and we see everybody else out there looks like everything's going so great, and my life's a little tough. This, Yeshua thing, this one hurts sometimes. And God's saying, just trust me, I've got it. Just trust me, I've got it. Now, as a slight divergence in our story today, we look at Numbers 13, verse 6 and 13, verse 8. So this section that I'm going to skip over the majority of here in Numbers 13 is the description of, or the detailing of each of the spies that were sent into the promised land and what tribe that they were head of. But I want to draw out these two particular for you because they were the two that brought back a positive report. They were the ones that brought back a report contrary to what the 10 spies with an evil report was saying. So Numbers 13, verse 6 says, from the tribe of Judah, Caleb, son of Jephunneh. And then 13 verse 8 says, from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, son of Nun. Hoshea becomes Joshua. Moses changes his name to Joshua. But you have Joshua, the son of Nun, from the tribe of Ephraim. And you had Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, from the tribe of Yehudah or Judah. Now what's really interesting here is that one of these two was not like the other. Caleb was not an Israelite, not by blood, not by lineage. The text tells us that Caleb was a Kenizzite. And if you go back to Genesis, when God first made a promise to Abraham that he was going to give him the promised land, he says, I'm going to give you this land, the land of these people, and the Kenizzites are one of those people. He says, I'm going to take the land from them, I'm going to give it to you. So here's Caleb, the head of the tribe of Judah, who becomes the kingship lineage of Israel, who is ultimately in the lineage of David and Solomon and Messiah, Yeshua. Here is Caleb, who's not an Israelite, who is one of the 12 spies sent in the promised land. He is the prince or the head of the tribe of Judah. Somehow this guy from Kenizzite lineage not only gets absorbed into Judah, but becomes the head of Judah and is one of the spies sent in representing Judah. And Joshua, who is of Ephraim, who is actually an Israelite. And so what we realize is bringing back a good report, but also these are the only two of that first generation that get to go into the promised land, and they're the ones that lead Israel in the promised land. It took a Jew and a Gentile together to lead Israel into the promises of God. Right? So this one new man that we read about in Ephesians that Paul deals with, it didn't begin in Ephesians. It didn't begin in Acts 10. It didn't begin with the Gospels. It began at creation. And we see the furthering of that narrative here with Joshua and Caleb. And by the way, as another aside, is that Joshua's brother, who the text specifically also says is a Kenizzite, or not his brother, the text specifically says is a Kenizzite in Judges, was the first judge of Israel. So not only was the head of Judah, the head of the tribe of Judah, and one of the two spies to go into the promised land, and one of the two men to lead Israel into the promised land, not actually an Israelite, but his brother becomes the first judge of Israel. And so we see this continuation of this image of Jew and Gentile together. So now we're going to skip back, or jump back into our direction today, and we're going to look at Numbers 13, beginning with verse 17. It says, as he sent them to explore the land of Canaan, he said to them, this is Moses talking to them, go up there through the Negev, then go up into the hill country, see what the land is like and the people living there, whether they might be strong or weak, few or many, in what kind of land are they living, is it good or bad? Also, what about the cities in which they are living? Are they unwalled or do they have fortification? How is the soil, fertile or poor? Are there trees on it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season of the first ripe grapes. So here Moses is telling the spies what to look for. How's the land look? How's the people look? Do they have walled cities, or are they just wide open, villages and plains? And what's the food look like? What's the ground look like? Is everything, and I kind of feel like to some degree Moses is having one of those moments. I think Moses is trying to kind of encourage himself of what God has in store. Because Moses listen, I know God said everything was going to be this way, but just do me a favor. See if it's actually how God said it was going to be, right? And then they come back, and I think Moses' biggest mistake, and Moses made a lot, but I think Moses' biggest mistake, and Joshua learns from it, Moses' biggest mistake is he sends the spies out in front of the entire nation, and the spies come back to bring their report to Moses in front of the entire nation. Whereas Joshua, when we go to the book of Joshua, instead of sending 12 spies, Joshua only sends 2. Why? Because there's only 2 that brought a good report back the first time. Joshua sends 2 spies in. He's figured, I got a 50-50 shot here, right? It'll be all right. Sends 2 spies in. Not only does he send 2 spies in, he sends them in private, and they come back to him alone in private. They don't go to the entire nation. They come to him. And so here Moses sends these spies in, and they go and they look around, they reconnoiter out the land. The Complete Jewish Bible translates the word spy as reconnoiter. It says they sent them in to spy out the land, and the Complete Jewish Bible says reconnoiter. And so since I was a little kid, this is my one chance a year to use a word that makes me sound smart. So I throw reconnoiter out as often as I can this time of year. But sends the spies out, they come back in, and in particular, it says, verse 23 of Numbers 13, says, when they reached as far as the valley of Eshcol, they cut a single branch with a cluster of grapes. It was carried on a pole between 2 of them. They also cut some pomegranates and some figs. That place was called the valley of Eshcol because of the cluster cut by Bnei Israel. They returned from investigating the land after 40 days. They traveled and returned to Moses, Aaron, and the entire community of Bnei Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They gave their report to them and the entire assembly. They showed the land's fruit. They gave their account to him and said, we went into the land where you sent us. Notice now they're shifting the discussion here. We went into the land where you sent us. This is your fault, Moses. Remember, how often do we read that from Israel? Moses, why did you bring us out here? Couldn't we have died well enough in Egypt? Why did you bring us here? We went to the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey. This is some of its fruit. Yes, the land is exactly how God said it would be. And here's the fruit to prove it. It is exactly how God said it would be. Today, you and I would love to be able to say that if somebody came to us and said it is exactly how God would say it, we go, okay, great, let's go, let's do it. We can do this now. Let's take it. It's ours, right? But odds are we would probably respond more like the 10 spies and the rest of Israel. It says exactly how God said. Here's some of the fruit. Everything is prime. Everything is just like he said. And then the next verse. Except, there's that beautiful word, except. The people living in the land are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the sons of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites are living in the mountains, and the Canaanites are living near the sea and along the bank of the Jordan. Oh my God, the exact people God said we were going to displace are living there. Who'd have thunk it? Not only is the land exactly how God said, not only is the fruit exactly how God said, but the people God said we were going to be taking it from are still there. Amazing. 400 years since it was spoken to Abraham, and it's exactly how God said it was going to be. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should definitely go up and capture the land, for we can certainly do it. Because greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. But the men who had gone up with him said, we cannot attack these people because they are stronger than we are. They spread among Bnei Israel a bad report. They begin to speak Lashon Hara. They begin to do what I call shadow talking. Right? They're going around the camp and talking to people in private and quiet and getting the crowd worked up and angry about things, right? They begin to spread among Bnei Israel a bad report about the land they had explored, saying, the land through which we passed to explore devours its residents. All the people we saw there are men of great size. We also saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our eyes as well as theirs. There's a lot of assumptions there. We felt, compared to them, these dudes are huge. Compared to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and they must have thought the same thing of us. It doesn't say they ever actually encountered them, that they could have known what the people thought of them. But all of a sudden, they go, look, the land's exactly like God said, but I feel like God got something wrong because we can't take these people. And you know what? You're right. You can't. On our own, we cannot fulfill God's purpose and promise for our life. It's just not possible. Wasn't possible for Israel. Hasn't been possible for anybody else along the line as you look through the biblical message. It's never been possible to make God's purpose, promise, calling for our life become a reality on our own. Without God's hand in the mix, it'll never happen. And the problem here was that the spies were looking at it with human perspective, with slave perspective, and they were looking at it going, we can't do this because they're too big for us. Everything is exactly how God said, but there's no way that God also got that part about us winning right. He got everything else right. Okay, I'll give him that, but there's no way he could get this part right too. How many of us feel like that in our lives sometimes? God said this was going to happen, A, B, C, or D, and we're going, okay, look, that first part, okay, maybe coincidence. It worked out okay, that was great, but the rest of this, it couldn't possibly happen. When we bought the building originally, or actually when we first made the arrangements for, at that point, what was at least with option on the property that's now our synagogue, we did not have the ability, like on paper, our congregation was like 5 years old, 6 years old at that point. On paper, us having our own property was not even a possibility. Like, it was an act of faith picking up the phone just to ask, hey, what's going on with that building over there? Like, that was, and I don't even know that I had the funds enough to make that phone call at that point in time. But nonetheless, we felt like this was something that God was doing, and so we reached out, we found out all this stuff, we sit down with them, we're like, okay, we'd like to have a lease with option, we'd like to have it for a 2-year lease, we'd like to pay X number of dollars a month for our rent, we'd like X percentage of that rental each month to go towards the purchase price as our down payment. We're going to give you X number of dollars as the down payment up front, and we want all of that to count towards the purchase price, and here's what we want the purchase price to be, and all of this. I mean, we just laid it all out there. I figured, look, if we're going to shoot as far into the imagination as possible, and we're going to see what God does, because if this is a God thing, it's going to have to be a God thing across the board. And by the way, the $5,000 we said we give them down, we didn't have that at that time. I still don't, to this day, I don't know how we came up with $5,000 in a couple of weeks. I don't know how it came about, but it was there when it was time. And so we talked to them, and they were like, all right, well, give us a couple of days, maybe a week or so. We've got to go back to the General Assembly and talk to them and see what's available and what's possible. And we have these offers on the table and this cash offer on the table and whatever. 4 hours or 5 hours later, I get a phone call from them and said, hey, we feel like this is the only thing that makes sense. We feel like this is a God-ordained thing, that you're supposed to have this building. We're passing on a cash offer that would have us done with it. We're passing on these other offers that are out there because we feel like this is what we're supposed to do. And all of a sudden I went, oh crap, I stepped out on a limb on that one, and now I got to figure out how to make, and then I remember, oh wait, no, I don't have to figure anything out. If this is God, we're just going to walk with it, right, and trust. And so we went in, entered into the lease with option. 2 years comes up, we still could not find anyone that would give us a mortgage for the property. We asked for an extension of that lease. They gave us an extension and said, but look, we need this deal to close and as quick as possible, whatever. And so we're looking. I'm calling banks that all they do is finance churches and houses of worship, their property. That's all that they do is finance houses of worship property. And I'm calling these people up that are believing organizations and trying to see what they could do for us. And none of them would touch us because we were buying a property that wasn't over $1 million, where we weren't borrowing over $1 million. And I said, wait. So you're telling me because as believers, we're buying a property that we might actually be able to afford, that's a problem? I don't understand how this works. And so nonetheless, after all this time, we couldn't find a loan. We start to get kind of discouraged because it wasn't all coming together. But at the same time, we're like, all right, look, God's brought us this far. It'll all work out. And then I meet with some pastors that I know in the area of one of the larger churches in the area. And I pitched an idea to them. I was like, I'm going to shoot. Again, we shot for the stars with the lease without, but I'm going to shoot with the stars again. Said, would you guys give us the money to pay the property off so that we purchased it, it's done, we can close on it, and we'll pay you X number of dollars a month towards that. And I'd worked it up. I was like, in 10 years, you're going to make 50% profit back for it. Like, we were shooting big. Like, there was no reason we'd offer anybody that much money in return. But we're laying it out there, and I'm like, okay, they'll negotiate. Maybe they'll come back down, and da-da-da. And I sat down with them, and the pastor goes, look, if you'd have called me a month ago, we would have helped you with this in a heartbeat. He goes, but I just started a sermon series at the church where I'm telling our church that we're working to get the church out of all debt. We're going to pay off everything we possibly can. Our plan is a 10-year debt-free plan. We're going to get rid of all of our debt in the next 10 years. And I can't, in good faith, after preaching this sermon, then turn around and say, oh, by the way, we took this major risk here, and here's what's... he goes, but I will tell you this. He said they had just at that point finished a building project on a larger sanctuary. And he said, look, obviously the length of time that church has been around was significantly longer than the length of time we had been around. They had their own property. They had their own office space separate from the property. They had money. They had multiple campuses. They had buku-doodles of money. They had everything ready to go. And they struggled to find financing for that expansion. And he said, we struggled for 3 years to find financing for the expansion. He goes, but God told us that he would give us the right relationship at the right time that would make it possible. And he said that's exactly what happened. It all happened at the right time, just the way it needed to be, and everything fell in place. He goes, look, I'm just telling you right now, this isn't working, but God has the right relationship at the right time with the right bank. And when it falls in place, everything will fall in place the way it should. And not a week later, we came across the bank that now finances us. And they said, look, on paper, you guys don't make any sense. There's no reason that this would ever work, but we're going to work really hard to find every possible way to say yes before we ever think about saying no. Give us a couple of days or a week and we'll get back to you. And that evening, they called me back and said, hey, I think we found a way. And God paved everything out for it to all fall in place. So I say all that to say this. When it looks like the odds are insurmountable, which is what the spies thought they were facing, insurmountable odds. Everything's exactly like God said, except these dudes are huge and we're not, and we were slaves and we don't know how to fight, and we had Egypt's armies, weapons, and yet when Egypt came after us, we were afraid to do anything, and we froze, and now they weren't thinking, but God picked up and fought for us, and everything played out. All they were thinking is what they couldn't do, right? And so as we were dealing with the building, as we were trying to have God's promise for children fulfilled in our lives, we were thinking, what can man do? What can we do in human strength? What can be done to make this happen? And God's going, no, you're looking at it wrong. It's not about what you can do. Let me do what I need to do to make my promises come real and come about. Numbers 14, I'm on the slides. I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to talk about it for a second. But Numbers 14, we read the community of Israel now has heard the spies' report. It's now been shadow talked through the nation as a whole, and the entire nation is scared to death. And they're going, there's no way we can do this, right? We can't do this. Moses, how could you possibly do this? And they begin to revolt against Moses there, and they said, let's pick a new leader that'll take us where? Not into God's promises. Bring us back to Egypt. Like, this is dumb. We should have never followed this guy. Let's just go back to Egypt. Everything would be okay back in Egypt. If only we had died in Egypt. If only we had died in this wilderness. right? It's kind of like the reverse of what we sing at Dainu at Passover. It would have been enough if God had only done this, and if God had only done this, but God did so much more. And here Israel's going, if only we had died in Egypt, or if only we had died out here in the world, only we had died or whatever. Not, it would have been enough if God had done this little bit. They're going, no, this was too much already. It was too much when you brought us out. It was too much when you brought us to Sinai. It was too much when you brought us here. It's too much. Let us die now and be done. And they said, let us choose a leader that'll take us back to Egypt. And Joshua and Caleb immediately begin to try and bring their hearts back to reality and encourage them to go take the land. And this is where God says, okay, here's the deal though. You're right. You can't do it. It's impossible for you to do it. But if you just simply trusted in me, it would have worked out. But now you're going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. I'm going to count your last 2 years towards that sentence, but you're going to be wandering in the wilderness for the next 40 years, and your children will be the ones that take the promised land because you didn't have the faith, but they will, right? And so ultimately, that's exactly what happens. And then Joshua and Caleb are the ones that are able to lead them into the promised land. And so for the rest of the book of Numbers, after this point, for all of the rest of the book of Numbers, we're just reading, waiting for that first generation to die. That's it. We're just waiting for them to die off, get out the way, and the next generation can take their place. Now, what's really intriguing about all of this, and what's really interesting about all of this, is that while all of this is going on, and God says you're going to spend the next 40 years dying out in the wilderness, Israel goes, you know what? We were wrong. God can do this. Let's go. And they begin to run into the promised land to take it, and hundreds die because they could not do it on their own, right? They thought they couldn't do it on their own. And God said, you're right, you couldn't, but I could have if you'd have trusted me. And they went, you're right, we should have trusted you. Let's go do it on our own. And then they die because of it. Our principle one more time. God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. I'm going to give you the promised land. I'm going to take it away from all these people. It is going to be yours. It wasn't contingent on Israel understanding what was going to happen. It wasn't contingent upon Israel thinking they could do it. It wasn't contingent upon Israel having anything to do with it. God just said, I'm going to do this. God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. So our faith must not waver when we face challenges. Now, in Matthew 14, we're going to move forward a little bit here. Matthew 14, we read about Peter. What we all know is the narrative of Peter walking on water, right? People, for whatever reason, we kind of skip over the fact that Yeshua was doing it first. Like Yeshua started the trend and Peter just wanted on board. But we skip over that because Peter walked on water and that was awesome. And then Peter took his eyes off Yeshua and he sank. And so we focus on Peter walking on the water. Now, obviously, there's a far greater story that's happening there, and it has to do with their faith of trusting and understanding what Yeshua had just done miraculously and feeding the thousands with just a little bit of bread and fish and feeding 5,000 people anyways and so on and so forth. But we hyper-fixate on the Matthew 14 narrative of Yeshua walking on the water and then Peter coming up after him. I'm going to actually skip past that. We're going to go to Mark 6. We're going to look at Mark's description of the account. So Matthew, it does kind of lend itself for us to, in our own understanding, try to understand what Peter was going through and what Peter's failures were and try to put ourselves in that place. But I want to put into perspective and I think Mark gives us a really good idea. And by the way, I'm not taking credit for having had this realization on my own. I had never seen this before. Of all things, God forbid, I'm scrolling TikTok the other day, and this pastor's video comes across my feed. He's talking about this, and I went, holy crap, I've never seen that. That's awesome. It's depressing that's the reality of the narrative, but that's awesome. And I started, it immediately in my spirit, something connected with Numbers, this week's Parsha, and the spies and everything. I went, nope, it's not just something I found on TikTok, and I say it all the time, a sermon that I preach has to speak to me first before I can ever bring it to you guys, and it did and does, and I'm bringing this to you anyways. But Mark chapter 6, this is after Yeshua has fed the thousands with a little bit of fish and a little bit of bread, right? It says, Mark chapter 6, verse 45, right away, Yeshua made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. So we're going to pause there. Don't go further on slides. We're going to pause there. Yeshua told his disciples to what? Get in the boat and go where? To the other side. So he's giving them their directions. He's giving them their order. That was it. Get in the boat, go to the other side. That's what their responsibility is. God's promise in this situation is you will get to the other side. Get in the boat, get to the other side. And Yeshua says, I'll catch up with you. I'm going to take care of the crowd. I'm going to send them away, but I'm going to catch up with you. Go into the next verse. After leaving them, he went up on the hillside to pray. right? Often we see Yeshua do this. Yeshua gets away from the crowd, gets away from his disciples to go spend some time alone with the Lord in prayer. After leaving them, he went up on the hillside to pray. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples struggling to row. Now, at this point, we know from Matthew 4 that there's this big storm that's going on. They're like dead to rights, scared to death that they're going to die out there. They're trying to row, and they're not getting anywhere, and they're freaking out about it, right? They're losing their mind on it. But this is what's really interesting. God didn't say the water is going to be easy to get to the other side. He didn't say you're going to make it to the other side in a hurry. He just said, get in the boat, get to the other side, I'll meet you over there. But here they are in the middle of the water. Everything's getting rough and crazy around them. They still are racking their brains on what in the world just happened in this huge, like, ridiculous miracle that they still got 12 baskets of food left over from when they didn't even start with a basket of food to begin with. And all this stuff's going on around them, and they can't wrap their heads around. They're thinking, what can we do? And God's going, no, it's not what you can do. It's what I can do. Let me do this. And so they're out there struggling to row, for the wind was against them. Around the fourth watch of the night, Yeshua comes to them, walking on the sea. And here's what stands out the most to me about this text, about this particular portrayal of the narrative. Yeshua comes to them, walking on the sea, and he wanted to walk past them. Yeshua had no intention of stopping and helping them get to the other side because he already gave them their orders and he already told them they would make it there. He said, I will meet you there. He didn't say, hey, try to get over there, and if you don't sink, I'll see you when I get there. He said, get in the boat, get to the other side, I'll see you over there. And here comes Yeshua walking across the water. They're struggling. They're losing their minds because the waters are rough and the waves are crashing over them and the rains are coming down and lightning striking, kind of like what we've experienced the last 17 and a half years in the last week. Lightning and thunder and waves crashing all over the place and all this kind of stuff's going on. And they're losing their mind. They're out here trying to row and figure out how they're going to do what God's already given them their order. Yeshua said, go there. You'll make it. I'll meet you. Just keep going along. I've got you covered. It'll all be okay. They could have simply went, Yeshua's done all these miracles. He's told us we can do stuff too. God, please make the waters calm down. Make the storm fade away. Right? Not in my own strength. God, only you can do this. Nope, that's not what they do. They keep trying to go on their own. Yeshua comes to them walking on the sea, and he wanted to pass by them. The only reason he stopped. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost and cried out in fear. Not they saw God in flesh walking past them who had just performed this absolutely mind-blowing, ridiculous miracle, turning a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish into enough food to feed 5,000 people and still have 12 baskets left over for us to have a snack on the way to the other side of the sea. No, they didn't look out and say, oh, that's Yeshua. Look, he just fed, he's walking on water, he's raised people from the dead, he's opened blind people's eyes, he's given lame people the ability to walk, and here he comes walking by. No, they saw somebody walking on the shore, and their first thought was, that's impossible, that's got to be evil. By the way, the same response the Pharisees and the Sadducees give Yeshua when he does miracles. This has got to be of Beelzebul. This can't possibly be of God. This has got to be of Beelzebul. Because God couldn't possibly do anything cool, right? But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and he said, take courage, I am. Do not be afraid. Take courage, I am. Do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them and the wind stopped. They were utterly dumbfounded, for they still hadn't understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. They were dumbfounded because they just saw all these crazy miracles going on. They just saw this miracle on the hillside where all these people were fed, and they couldn't figure out how in the world this just happened. And they just watched Yeshua walking on water and climbing the boat, and as soon as he got in the boat, everything settled down. And they couldn't figure out how in the world this happened. And instead of going, okay, Yeshua, look, cool party trick. Like you're talking to a sleight of hands magician. Like, that card trick was really cool, but could you show me where you had that ace of hearts hiding at? Could you tell me how I need to see how this played? That was really cool, Yeshua. Could you tell us how that happened? Could we maybe do that? Like, could we have figured this out? Like, how's this going to work out, right? No. They get mad. They get hard-hearted. They take on the attitude of Pharaoh. Now, I'm taking that a far extreme, but I want you to understand the language is the same. Their hearts got hardened. They became angry. Yeshua said, get in the boat and head on. I'll meet you over on the other side. He comes walking across the water with zero intention of stopping to help them. Not because Yeshua wanted them to die, not because Yeshua didn't care, but because Yeshua knew that they were going to make it if they just had faith. Yeshua knew that they had the ability to cry out to their Father in heaven and have it all settled and calmed down if they only had the faith to do it. Yeshua had zero intention of stopping and helping them. And here's the thing, far too often in our lives, God gives us a calling or a promise or a directive or a command, and we're so focused on why we can't do it, why it's impossible, why the giants are too big and the fruit is too huge and everything else is exactly like God said, but I can't. We're so focused on what we can't do that we can't fathom that there's something miraculous God has in store to get us to where his promises are. That if we just trust in him, if we just walk in faithfulness with him. I'm on the phone with my buddy going, I'm done. I don't want to do this crap anymore. God tells me this. He gives me this promise. He gives me this hope. And then he rips it away. I don't want to do this anymore. And God's sitting there going, but just trust. Just trust. Look, I'm here today when I should have been dead countless times. When I was a kid, I was diagnosed with asthma so severe that I should have been a bubble kid. They told me that if I walked outside my front door, the dust outside would kill me. I was diagnosed with what they thought was a hole in my lung at the exact same time, and I had bronchitis in a very severe way at the exact same time. They legitimately thought I might die any day because of this breathing issue. Go back to the doctor 2 weeks later so they can come up with a prognosis and figure out what in the world to do and a treatment plan and all this kind of crap. They take me to x-ray machine after x-ray machine after x-ray machine, to MRIs, to everything they could possibly put their hands on. I'm like 5, 6 years old at this point. Everything they could possibly get their hands on to run tests, and they come back out. It's only been 2 weeks. They come back out and said, I don't know what in the world's going on, but there's nothing. There's no asthma, no bronchitis, no hole in the lung. There's nothing. And my dad goes, I know what happened. We prayed and God worked. I've been in car accidents that should have killed me. I've been in near motorcycle accidents that could have killed me. I have had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity for my own stupidity to be the cause of my extinction. And I'm here because of the hand of God. Not because of anything of my own strength, but because of the hand of God. You are all here because of the hand of God. And God's promise and his blessings spoken to you, over you, and for you are not contingent upon whether or not your life is easy. It is contingent upon God's ability. And his ability is limitless, even though your faith may have limits. But even when your faith runs into its limits, we must continue to walk faithfully, trusting that he can do what he said he was going to do. We can look around us and go, the fruit's too big, the land is huge, the people are giants, but God said this is going to work. I'm just going to trust him. I'm in the dinghy that God said, go to the other side. I'll meet you over there. Things are a little rough. I don't know how we're going to pull this off, but he said we're going to, and he said he's going to meet us there. I'm just going to keep going until we get there. It'll be okay. God's got this. And when we hit those moments where we're struggling, we feel like we're fighting against the storms and the waves, and we think that Yeshua is just going to walk right on by, it may have been his intention to walk right on by, to meet us where he told us we were going to be. But he recognizes, just as he did with the disciples, that if left on our own, we may not make it to where we're supposed to be because we don't have the faith at points in our lives to walk in the fullness of God's promises. And so sometimes he's got to come along and be that crutch for us to help us limp into the finish line. Our principle one more time. God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. So our faith must not waver when we face challenges. As I prepare to close, and it was funny that this was in the worship set this morning because I rarely ever actually look at it. I have no clue what we're going to sing when we get here on Saturdays. It's not my job. I leave it to the people that is their job, and I just trust that God's in control. And I didn't know that this song was in the worship set until it started. And I went, that sounds familiar. Oh, I just was dealing with that this morning because this morning God put it on my heart to add this in last minute into the message too. But Psalm 46, verse 2 in traditional Hebrew translation, you got the TLV, the Complete Jewish Bible, or some traditional Jewish translation of the Tanakh. If you've got an English translation like the NIV, KJV, something like that, you're going to find it starting in verse 1. But it says, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth change, though the mountains topple into the hearts of the sea, Though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling, Selah. There is a river whose stream made glad the city of God, the holy dwelling place of Elyon. God is in the midst of her. She will not be shaken. God will help her when morning dawns. Nations are in an uproar. Kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, and the earth melts. Adonai Tzevaot is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Selah. Doesn't matter what's going on around you. Doesn't matter how bad the world's shaking. Doesn't matter how terrible the UN or whatever government you can think of may be in your perspective. God is in control. Adonai Tzevaot is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Selah. Come see the works of Adonai, who brings devastations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear. He burns chariots with fire. And by the way, he can stop the attack of the enemy in your life too if you simply trust in him and allow him to do what he wants to do in your life. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the heaven and the earth. Adonai Tzevaot is with us. The God of Jacob is our strong tower. Selah. There are two words in the Hebrew that are translated as something along the lines of refuge, strength, stronghold, something along those lines. There are two words used in the Hebrew in Psalm 46 that we translate to these concepts. The first we find in verse 2, and it's the word machazeh. Machazeh is a shelter that we run to because we find ourselves outside of a stronghold and the enemy's crashing down on us. So imagine you're out in the woods somewhere in a really bad storm. I'll make it even easier because this is something I deal with quite often as a biker. Riding on the motorcycle, all of a sudden out of nowhere, big storm clouds appear, rain's falling, I'm about to hit a wall of this monstrous storm in front of me, which oddly enough happens way more than it should. But riding along, hit this rain, I'm cruising along, like I could have been in the garage, I could have been in my car with the roof over me, I wouldn't be getting wet, but here I am soaked to death. A machazeh is when that overpass comes up that I can sneak up under and stand under and try and remain dry for a little while, try to find a little shelter from the rain. The machazeh is when you're running through the forest and the enemies are attacking and all of a sudden you see a cave that you can hide in, like David hiding in the caves in the mountains of Israel. You can hide in a cave. But a machazeh is something that you're running to because you're outside of the will of God. You're outside of the protection of God. For whatever reason, you're walking contrary to how you should be walking with the Lord. And life gets hard, things get rough, and you recognize where your failure is, and you run back to the Lord as your stronghold, as your shelter, as your refuge. And guess what? He's there with arms wide open waiting for you. In fact, when you turn around to run back to him, you run into his chest because he's been there the whole time, waiting for you to do that very thing. But he is our machazeh. He is our shelter that we run to when we realize we're out of order in the wrong place. The second word that we see is used in verse 8 and 12 of Psalm 46, and it's the word mizgav. Mizgav is an intentional defensive structure, something like a fort or a tower. Think of like a military installment, a military base, a stronghold that you've got. When you're in the Mizgav, you're protected. Imagine Mizgav is you're walking in the power and presence of God. You're walking in his will for your life, and he's got his defenses around you, and he's protecting you. It doesn't matter what the enemy throws at you. He's got it covered. Right? He is your stronghold. He is your safe place. He's your refuge. But on the off chance that you're human in a fallen world, living in a brief fallen moment or years, and you realize that I'm out of God's order, I'm out of his will, I'm out of his place, you can run back, and he's still your machazeh. And then once you find your safety and security in him as your machazeh, he'll become your mizgav when you continue to walk faithfully in his ways. God is our refuge, our strong tower. He is our defensive structure. Whether we choose to remain in his defenses or we find ourselves like the first generation of Israel after the evil report of the spies outside of his protection, all we have to do is run back and he's got us. All we have to do is bunker down in his defenses and he's got us. The disciples in the boat, all they had to do was drop on their knees and cry out to the Lord. And I believe without a doubt that God would have easily settled that storm. And Yeshua would have kept walking right on by as was his intention. I think the only reason they saw him was because he allowed them to see him because he recognized their fear and that their fallen humanity in that moment had taken over. And they didn't think they were going to make it to where God said they were going to be. God's calling, our principle again, God's calling and promises are not contingent on an easy life. So our faith must not waver when we face challenges. I'd like to call our worship team back up. So what are you impatiently waiting on the Lord for today? Are you waiting on God's call in your life to materialize? Are you waiting for your children or your parents or your siblings to come to faith in Yeshua? Whatever it is, are you truly waiting on God? Or are you truly patiently and humbly giving him room to move in your life? Or are you letting him bring about his promises at his own time? Or is it what is more likely that you're beginning to doubt him? Or trying to make his promises come about in your own strength instead of trusting in him to bring it about in his own time? Are you beginning to give in to doubt and fear because the waves and the storm are becoming too much for your own strength? Are you beginning to think that Yeshua is just going to walk right on by and leave you dying out in the middle of nowhere? We all go through these moments of fallenness. We all go through these times where we take our eyes off of the target, off of what we're supposed to be fixed on. When we take our eyes off of the presence of the Lord leading and guiding us. It happens over and over again in our lives. We have these moments of weakness in a fallen world, but the truth of the matter is that God has never given up on you. His promises will never fail you. He has not forgotten what he's told you he is going to do. He's not forgotten what he's told you is going to come about, and he's not stopped working to bring it about. You just haven't quite gotten to his timing yet. But that doesn't mean that it's our job to turn around and try to make it happen on our own. It doesn't mean it's our job to find a way to force this into reality. We have to continue to walk faithfully, because when Israel lost sight of what God said he was going to do and they became afraid and fearful and angry at God for it, they tried to make it happen on their own and everything came crashing down around them. But the truth of the matter is that our God is a mighty God, is a faithful God, is a loving God, is a gracious and cherishing God. He is a nurturing God who takes care of his people, who will only do what is right and good for those who call upon his name. And his desire is for us to see the fullness of everything he has in store for us. The only contingency is us. What are we going to do? Are we going to walk in faithfulness and trust in him? Are we going to allow him to do what he wants to do? Or are we going to get in his way? Are we going to listen to the spies of the world around us saying, God can't possibly do that? There's no way that could come about. Are we going to listen to the doctors say, nah, there's no hope. You can't get pregnant. Your lungs are never going to work right. You're going to die. Cancer's going to take you over. It's all going to go to the wayside. Or are we going to trust in God to do what God's going to do? Are we going to trust in God to do what God's going to do? Are we going to trust in him to bring his promises into fulfillment? What has God spoken into your life that he has told you he is going to make happen? Are you trusting in him to allow him to do what he needs to do to see that come about? Or are you cowering in fear like the disciples in the boat in the middle of the storm? And here comes the presence of God walking past you and you're afraid that it's the enemy. Imagine had they simply gotten into his wake and allowed his wake to carry him along. Now, I don't know whether or not he was walking hard and fast enough to make a wake, but in my brain, that's the way I kind of picture it. Imagine if they just simply, oh, that's Yeshua. Let's just hook in behind him and see where he goes. Throw a rope out, see if he'll pull us to shore. He said he's going to do this. Let's trust him. Let's walk across. Let's keep moving. We fixate on Peter walking on water and then losing sight of Yeshua and sinking. And we fixate on it like that's the moral of the story. That's what it's all about. But it wasn't. It wasn't about that at all. As a matter of fact, Peter got out in the water because of doubt. If it's really you, tell me to come out there with you. And the whole time, Yeshua was just wanting to walk right by us because he's already told us what's going to happen. He's already told us where we're supposed to be, and all we got to do is get there. He's already made a way. He's already made it possible. We just got to follow what he's leading us to do. So today, as we prepare to leave this place, I want to encourage you, trust in God. His promises will never fail you. His calling will never fail you. His purposes will never fail you. His word will never fail you. The only thing that could fail you is when you try to take it in your own hands and your own control. Trust in God. Patiently wait on him and give him the room in your life to do what he needs to do. Give him the room in your family. Give him the room in your workplace. Give him the room in your congregation. Give him the room in your political fears. Give him the room in whatever else there is. Give him the room to do what he needs to do. Get out of his way, trust him, and follow behind his footsteps. Because whether we like it or not, whether we get the outcome we think we're supposed to get or not, he's in control. And all we should be cared about is getting the outcome he desires for us. It doesn't matter how big the enemies are on the other side. He's in control. He's far greater. Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. Av Rachamim, Father of mercies, we worship you, Lord. We thank you that you are a God who is ever faithful. Father, we thank you that you are a God who speaks promises and brings those promises about into fruition and reality. Lord, I thank you that time and time again in my own life and my own walk, I have seen the reality of your promises ringing true. Even in moments where I gave in and cowered into the fear of the what if. Father, I thank you that you have been faithful. Lord, I thank you that in the work that you have done here at Ma'im Chaim, that you have been faithful to bring about your promises in fruition. And those that we're still waiting on, those promises you've spoken to us over the years that have not come into fruition, Lord, give us the courage, give us the strength, give us the wherewithal to trust in you to bring them about in your time. To allow you to move mightily and powerfully. Lord, the same for each and every one of our lives, whether you are here in-house or joining us online or listening to this in a podcast later on. Father, begin to encourage us and uplift us now to trust in you and in what you desire to do in our lives, and to give you the freedom to move mightily and powerfully in our hearts and our lives, not for our sake, not for our good, not for our name, but for yours to be glorified by us before all men, that all will come to see the glory of the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, the name above all names, who is worthy of our praise. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachinu. In the name of Yeshua our Messiah we pray, and everyone says, Amen.